Welcome to today's LEDs Magazine webinar, Mastering LED Driver Programming, ERP Drivers in Development and Production Environments, sponsored by ERP Power. I'm Carrie Meadows, Managing Editor of LEDs Magazine, and I'll be moderating this webinar. Just a few notes for our audience before we begin. If you have any technical issues during today's session, please send your question through the questions window and our webinar specialist will help you. We recommend disabling pop-up blockers or browser extensions that may interfere with the webinar player. We welcome your questions. Our speaker will answer as many as possible after the main presentation, but feel free to send them in at any time. Simply type your query into the question window on the side of your screen and hit the submit button. Also, please note that today's session is being recorded and will be available on the LEDs Magazine website within the next 24 hours. All registrants will be notified by email when the archive is available. A PDF of today's slides and other materials can be located in the Resources menu. Let's meet today's speaker. Mark McAndrew is ERP Power's Product Line Manager, responsible for creating and publishing technical marketing materials for ERP products, several of which have received industry awards program recognition. Mark conducts training presentations for ERP's sales team and distributors, and he aids in new product development. He has also presented at external educational events such as past LEDs Magazine webinars. Prior to ERP, Mark served as an officer in the United States Coast Guard as a deck watch officer and also as a project manager, organizing an electronics upgrade to the service's small boat fleet. He holds a BS degree in electrical engineering from the United States Coast Guard Academy. Welcome back, Mark. It's good to be talking to you again, and the floor is yours.
All righty. Thank you, Carrie. Welcome, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about ERP's programming software, all of the different functionality that it offers, and different ways that you can use it, both when you're designing for your fixtures and also once you've decided on these features and you're ready to move to a production environment. So today we're going to be going just a quick overview of the software, a couple little tips during the installation process. We'll go over the interface of the software itself, and then we'll get into the nice details of actually using the software, both in design environments and then in production environments. So the programming software that we offer, it goes by a number of different names. They're all very interchangeable. It's officially called the Driver Configuration Tool. Sometimes you'll see people refer to it as the customer GUI, the ERP software, the driver tool, anything like that. Those all refer to this same piece of software. It only runs on a Windows operating system. So if you do use a MacBook or an Apple operating system, you're going to need to either get a virtual machine or some sort of emulator that runs Windows. As far as where you can get the software, on our website at the top of the bar, or at the top of the website, there's a section called Design Resources. You just hover over that, scroll down to Software, and then you'll see where you can download the software. If you have any questions after this webinar, we do have a support email address. It's shown right here, support@erppower.com. It's got about 8 people on it, and one of them is going to be able to answer your question and respond in a timely manner. In addition to the software, you are going to need one of 2 programming cables. The one you see on the top there, it's got a 3.5 millimeter audio jack on one end. That's going to be used for the majority of our driver families. And then we also have an NFC wand that's used specifically to program the CNB, the DAL, and the VZM families. These cables, you're able to order them from one of our distributors, and you really only need 1 or 2. You don't need to have a whole bunch of them. All right, so going through the installation process, you'll see in the bottom here, this is what it looks like on our website. And then this top image, these are the actual files that you're going to get when you download the software. Before you install the software for the first time, you're going to need to install the drivers for those cables that I just showed. And so to do that, you're just going to run that executable program, USB_jack_com drivers. That works for both the cable with the audio jack and the NFC one. Those both use the same drivers. You only need to do that the first time you install the software. If you're doing any updates afterwards, you just need to run the actual executable. So that's that ERP LED configurator, and the most recent version that we released is 2.1.1. And the final thing to note here is that we send updates out. We let you know through whatever email you apply with. We don't use that email for any other reason. So please use a professional email, one that you monitor pretty frequently. All righty, so moving on to the interface. When you first open up the software, this is what you're going to be greeted with. You're going to see the background kind of blurred, and then you're going to have two options of which mode you load into, depending on what you're doing. So you can either load into production mode or design mode. And then you'll see down below, we have an additional functionality of being able to password protect the design mode. You can create that password yourself, but that's a way to, in a production environment, prevent anyone that maybe hasn't been trained on this software as much, to prevent them from being able to go into the design side and kind of mess around, maybe do things that they're not familiar with, kind of just as a safety precaution. So once you choose, this is what you're first going to see, and this is what you're going to see if you do not have a cable connected or a driver connected to the software. Once you get your driver connected, you'll see this field on the left populate with all of these fields. You'll see this green light down in the bottom left-hand side. That's going to tell you that you're connected to a driver. And this left-hand side of the screen is more specifically being used for the development kind of phase, whereas on the right-hand side is going to be where you're going to use it more for production. Going through each of these fields, the vast majority of them are rather self-explanatory, but just a couple things to note are that the firmware revision and the hardware revision, those are more for our tracking purposes. If there are ever any issues in the field, we can narrow it down to a specific firmware or hardware revision, and this helps us. And then some of these functions are limited to specific driver families. So the NTC function, the 0 to 10 volt function, the triac function, those aren't going to show up on every single driver, only the ones that have those capabilities. And then additionally, kind of as a little debugging tool or a way to interrogate the driver, you can see how long it has been operated for, the number of times that it's power cycled, and if there's ever any over temperature events, those are going to get logged in here. So if you are noticing or getting reports from customers that they're starting to shut off in the field, it might be a good idea, if you're investigating, to plug in one of these drivers into the software tool. And then if you see temperature events, then you can kind of get a feel for what might be causing these issues in the field. The line transient events, those are only on a couple product families. They're not on all of them, but they just track the number of times that there's any transient event on the line. Additionally, as a helpful little troubleshooting tool. And then down at the bottom of that left-hand side, you've got kind of the meat and potatoes of what you're going to be doing when you're using the software to design a driver for your fixture. So you've got that modified driver program. We'll go over its functionality a bit more later. as well as the Add Connected Driver Program to Database button. The firmware section, that select firmware and upgrade unit firmware, once again, it is very rarely going to be used, but that's if there is a firmware issue, you can use this portion of the GUI, those two fields, to update the firmware. Very rarely happens, but we do have that functionality there. And then finally at the bottom left hand of the GUI, it tells you what the status of the connection is. So if it's gray, that means that your machine or your workstation has not identified that it has a cable connected to it. If you're seeing that when you have a cable connected to the software, it's usually indicative that you forgot to run that COM driver executable that I mentioned earlier. When you see red, that means that the software identifies that there is a cable connected to the workstation, but there's no driver connected. And then when it's green, it means that the cable's connected and that the driver has been connected and the software can see it. And then finally, you've got a little button down there that lets you switch between production and design mode. Now moving over to the right-hand side, these are tools that are more used in the production environment. Going through what they actually mean, the top section is related to any printer functionality. You can use it to configure. You have that configure printer button, which lets you set up the printer, and then the retry print button if a label fails to print while you're doing production programming, then you can use that to just print another label. Then in the middle section, you've got where the software is going to save a CSV file after the lot programming. I'll go more into detail on that later. But just where you can designate where those files get saved after each lot programming. We also have functionality on using a network location as opposed to a hard directory on your machine. So that's what that use network database button is for. And then down at the bottom, we've got kind of the big interface for doing production programming. That's where you're going to get started with it. That's where you're going to stop it. It gives you the indications of the status of the lot programming. And then it also allows you to export it and import your configuration files, which I'll go into a bit more detail later. All righty. So moving on to this kind of what I said, the meat and potatoes, we're going to first start off with programming in a design environment. So this is you're designing your fixture, you've identified your load, you know that you need to have it at say 500 milliamps, you know what kind of dimming profile you're going to want to use. That's when you're going to be in this design environment on the left-hand side of the screen. And just important to note is that not all drivers are going to have all of these different functionalities. For example, the PKM series, which is one of our popular products, it has NTC functionality, but as opposed to some of our other products, it doesn't have a dim to off option. So these aren't going to be applicable for every single driver family, but we'll cover kind of all of the use cases. So you've got it plugged in, you've got your driver plugged in, you know what you want to do to this driver to make it work for your fixture. So what you're going to do is once it's been connected, you'll click on this Modify Driver Program button, which will then open up a window that will look like this. You can see on the left-hand side, you've got a box that you can enter your operating current into, and that's going to be determined by your load, how hard you want to run your LED. That's what you're going to use the output current for. And then additionally, you have options for customizing the dim profile. There's a ton of different dimming profiles out there. Some are more widely used than others, but we are very kind of open in what we allow our users to do with how they're going to decide what dimming profile they want to use. We have a number of drop-down menus that are just different default dimming profiles that you can choose from, and then you can also just define your own dimming profile. So you can see in this field on the left-hand side, and specifically for the PTB, which doesn't have that dim to off functionality, you can enter what you want your high level to be on the 0 to 10 volt dimming profile, what you want the minimum level to be, so where in the 0 to 10 volt dimming curve do you want it to bottom out, and then you can choose at what level you want it to bottom out at. Going through the other dimming profiles, the default ones that you can choose to, if a driver has dim to off, it will default to that 1% with dim to off dimmer profile in the top left. And if it's like the PTB series where some of the versions do not have a dim to off functionality, then it's going to default to the one below that, the 1% dim without dim to off. You can see kind of all these different default dimming profiles for whatever you want to use. To note is that ANSI C137.1 in the lower right-hand corner, it's been a proposed kind of standardized dimming profile. So we have that if you want to comply with that standard. It hasn't, in my experience, been fully adopted yet. So it's not super popular, but that function is there if you want to be compliant with that standard. Alrighty, and then these are the last two final dimming profiles. So the ESS is one of our more popular fixed output products. And so we have an option to mimic that same dimming profile of those ESS series. And then on the right-hand side is what I showed earlier. But this version with dim to off, you can set all of those values. Alrighty. With some of our driver families, specifically PTB and PHB, you do have the option to customize the conduction angles for using with TRIAC and ELV dimmers. So if you're going to use a phase cut dimmer, we do have this functionality for those product families. It's not toyed around with too much. These default settings that we have are what we have tested and what we have found to be the most successful for being used with the widest variety of phase cut dimmers. But if you want to design your fixture to work with a dimmer that maybe doesn't look as good with these drivers, then you can tune those conduction angles to try to get better dimming performance when using a phase cut dimmer. Alrighty. So moving on to the NTC functionality, so negative temperature coefficient. Our drivers, while they do have protections in place to fold back and decrease the output side if they start to get too hot, if you have a specific temperature that you want to stay under, then you can use this functionality to enable that. Like I said before, it's on the PKM series. And what you can do is you use this with an NTC thermistor, and when it gets too hot, you can decide at what levels it should start to throttle back, at what levels it should recover, how low it should throttle back the current, and you're able to customize all of that with this functionality in the software. So things to notice are that you can change the functionality, basically what the driver is going to do. This is going to help if you want to make it so that it alerts someone in the space that the driver is starting to get too hot. You can use this function, the enabled with flash function, and basically if that thermistor has reached the level where it's gotten too hot and its resistance has dropped too far, then the actual driver will start to cycle its output and will cause the light to flash. And that's a good way if you want to have control over your thermals and you want to make sure that the fixture and all of the internals are not getting too hot. When it comes to marking when it comes to determining what those values are, there are a couple rules that are in place, and you'll see on the next slide basically that the bottom threshold has to be less than the top threshold and the recovery threshold. The recovery threshold has to be larger than the other two, and then the top trigger threshold has to be higher than the bottom trigger, but it can be less than the recovery. And then finally, you can choose at what level you want to throttle it down to. And so that's what all these fields in the bottom left-hand side are for. It's a really cool tool, lets you have more control of the fixture once it's in the field to make sure that people aren't running them too hot. So once you've made your decisions on how you want to design this driver, you'll hit that. You will hit this button in the bottom left-hand corner that says Program. And then you'll be greeted with this screen. It lets you know that the driver has been programmed. And then once you've seen it, it'll update. And if this is what you want, you've gone out and tested it. You make sure that this is the driver settings that you want for all of the drivers that are going to be in this fixture. Then you can click this Add Connected Driver Program to Database, and it's going to save these settings to your local folder. So you add it, you can name it what you want. I recommend using a concise naming convention that still kind of identifies everything that you want it for. If you're using it specifically for a fixture series, then you can name it like PKB or PTB and then that fixture series so you know which one to go for. But once you've named it, then it's going to be held in your configure folder or in your configuration file. Now, it's pretty common that the station that you're going to be doing the design on is not the same station that you're going to be using to program these in a production environment. And so if that's the case for you, you can see this button in the right-hand corner, Export Config File. You can save a configuration file that's going to hold all of your configurations that you've made. And then you can take that file, bring it to another workstation using whatever means you want. And then you use that Import Configuration File button to the left of that to load up those previously saved configurations. All righty. So now that we've kind of done the programming, we've decided what we want to do. Now we're at a point where we want to, say, program 100 drivers very quickly to get them into fixtures. All right. So in this production mode, the left side of the GUI is disabled. That prevents unauthorized users from kind of messing around with your configurations. And then also, if you're on a production floor, it can be hard to identify which drivers have already been programmed. So we've added functionality to interface with a couple different printers that will let you add labels with new output values onto the drivers themselves, so anyone in your production floor can more easily identify when a driver has been programmed. Alrighty, so once you've got the screen open, you click that Start Lot Programming button, and you'll see this window. If you have the driver family or the driver that you want to configure and do lot programming with, then it's going to automatically show that driver, that specific model. If you don't have a driver plugged in, then it's going to default to the first one on the list, and then you'll have to use that drop-down menu at the top to select the correct driver family. Once you've selected the correct driver, or if you open up this menu while it's plugged in, then you'll see all of the configurations. You'll see For this specific PTB, I had my factory default, so the way it leaves the factory, and then you can see the previous configuration that I saved to the file. So I can select that, and then at the bottom of this, I can add a lot ID or a name. Usually, I would say use like what fixture it's going into and then the date, because then after this is all done, if you run into any issues, it'll be easier for you from a record keeping side to see if those drivers were programmed correctly. And then finally, you just enter in the number of drivers that you want to program and then click Start Lot Programming. So what's going to happen when you do that is that kind of this box on the right-hand side of the screen, it's going to be yellow, and then once it's successfully programmed a driver, it says, hey, that driver's been programmed correctly, let me program the next one. And then at the bottom here, you've got a visual status indicator. So when I just did a lot programming for 3 for this demonstration, you can see after I completed the first one, it kind of incremented the progress bar. So now I know I'm a third of the way done. I've programmed a third of my drivers. For you, in your situation, it'll probably be more like 50 or 100 or 500. So that is a good indicator for your people on the production floor of how far they've got left to do, how many more drivers they need to program. Once you unplug that driver, the software will enter kind of a neutral state where it's just going to be waiting for the next driver to be plugged in so that it can program it. There's quite a bit of sophisticated kind of protections on here. If you plug in a driver that's already been programmed in this lot, the software is going to identify that. It's going to let you know, hey, that driver, we programmed it, but you already programmed that. So at the end of this, if you are done, you're going to be basically 1 driver less than what you originally had your lot programmed for. So it just lets you know, it still programs it, I believe still increments it, but will kind of let you know if anything is getting a little funny. And then once you've finished programming all of the drivers, then you'll get this notification. It's going to say, hey, I finished that. If you want to go check out the log, here's the location. This is the file name. And so what I was referring to earlier is this is where you use that log folder location to designate where you want these files to go. Basically, it's a CSV file, so it's something you can open in Excel, and it's going to show you the barcodes for each of the drivers that were programmed, whether or not the programming was successful, and it's just got a lot of good record-keeping functionality for you to be confident that the drivers have been programmed correctly and are going to be going into the fixture with the correct settings. Now for identifying which drivers have been programmed in a lot programming field, it can be hard because there's no visual indication on the drivers themselves that they've been programmed. So you can use like a Sharpie, just mark somewhere on the label with a little dot or a star. But I think the most comprehensive way of doing it would be to get one of these label printers. We support 2 printers at the moment. We support a TSC printer and a Zebra printer. The actual way for setting up these printers is rather in depth, but the instruction manual that Carrie has made available for you to download and read through. It's included anytime you download the software from our website. The instruction manual really goes into a lot of good depth on how to set up these printers, a lot of good support. And then, like I said earlier, we do have that support email address that if you're running into any issues with setting up the printer, you can send us an email and let us know that you're having issues, and we'll be more than happy to help you. So once you've got your printer identified, you'll go into the software, you'll configure it, which will take you to this screen. Depending on which printer you have a different level of functionality. The TSC printer, by default, the 4 fields that are printed on the label are the lot ID number, so whatever you name it, then the date that it was programmed, the output current, and the output voltage. And then for the Zebra printer, on the right-hand side, you can set up which parameters you want to show on those labels. So that's kind of the different functionality between the two printers, but they both give you really good opportunities to identify when a driver has been programmed. So if you set up your production line, once you plug in the driver, it's been lot programmed, the printer will run, it'll print a label, you can take that label, add it onto the driver, and now you're confident that this driver A has been programmed and B been identified as such. Once you've connected the printer, this indicator will turn green. That lets you know you're good to go. And then finally, if you ever run into an issue where the printer does not print after you've done a lot program, you can click that retry print button and it'll just print another copy of that label for you to be able to use to identify drivers. And so with that, that brings us to the end of our presentation, and we're ready to open it for questions.
Great, thanks, Mark. Let's see what we have for questions. Do I have to update my software every time a new update is released?
Okay, yes, so I would highly recommend it. If you're not using any new products that have been released since the last software has been released, then you're not going to run into any issues. But like any piece of software, it's always good to have the most up-to-date version. And then if we release a new driver family, it's not going to have the full support on an older revision of the software as it will if you're keeping it up to date.
That makes sense. It's another one of those things where you're going to continue to give people an opportunity to see something that they're familiar with, right? This interface, right, but have new features and new devices added to it whenever that's possible.
Yeah.
Okay. How often do software updates typically occur?
So they usually will occur around every 6 months is kind of, in our experience, how often we've developed enough functionality to warrant a new release. So I don't know if you saw earlier, but our last release was in October. We're getting ready to do a new release that has a bunch of cool new functionality. It enables you to use a barcode scanner when you're doing lot programming. To basically, you have a list of these barcodes that are at the workstation desk, and then you just scan the barcode and it'll automatically choose which configuration you want, which driver family you want to program. It kind of helps cut through what can sometimes be confusing, which is navigating to the correct driver and then navigating to the correct configuration. So that's going to be a way to more easily streamline production environment programming.
I can imagine, given the number of items that you mentioned, the person might be working with in the production environment, 50, hundreds, that would be a significant way to reduce the time that it takes to do this. We had another person who wanted to know how many different SKUs of programmable drivers are available.
So there's quite a few. There are, I think, 7 or 8 families of drivers that are programmable. Just going off the top of my head, there's the PSB, PHB, PTB, PDB, VZM, DAL, CDB, PKB, PKM, and each one of those has between about, PKB only has 3 SKUs, whereas the PSB, I think, has around 20. So there are quite a few SKUs that are programmable.
That was just off the top of your head, huh?
Yeah, well, yeah, I know these things.
Let's see. Will you be able to program the drivers when the driver is powered up? And will the driver power up properly with the audio jack plugged in?
So yes, so you don't need to have the driver energized when you plug it in for programming, but if it is powered up, that's fine. You can still plug it in, you can program it. Will the driver power up properly with the audio jack plugged in? Yes. So the answer to that is yes. So you don't need to have it energized, but you can, and you will not run into issues.
Great. For temperature events that are detected by the software, does that mean that the driver will shut off due to the overheating event, or just that the driver reached the high temperature?
So the functionality is a little bit different for a couple of the drivers, but for the vast majority of them, they'll start to reduce the output current once they hit a certain temperature. It's usually between 75 and 85 degrees C that they will start to throttle back. And at that point, that's going to be logged as a temperature event because you're going over the designed temperature for the driver, but it's not going to shut off completely. Some of them enter a state, well, they'll flash a little bit, and then they'll start to cool down, turn on, maybe heat back up, and then shut off again. But the drivers, basically, once it kind of enters the region of above 75 degrees C, then that is what is going to be logged as a temperature event.
Okay. Have you ever worked with, sorry, I'm trying to make this a little larger so I can see it better. Have you ever worked with an MBI 66GD LED driver IC?
I have not worked with that specific driver, no.
Okay.
Do you want me to handle that, Mark? The MBI 6660 is a step-down DC-DC converter from macro-block. We at ERP, we don't use this specific LED driver ICs in our LED drivers or LED power supplies. But again, we make LED drivers or LED power supplies. We do not make LED driver ICs. But the answer to your question is we don't use this particular LED driver IC in any of our products.
Thank you. Let's see. Is there support or training to choose the correct replacement driver from a failed driver in the field?
Okay, so if you're talking about a failed ERP driver in the field, then the way our warranty program works is that you would contact the fixture manufacturer and they will honor our warranty on our behalf, and then we'll credit them for the driver on the back end. If you're referring to a driver from some other manufacturer that fails in the field, what you can do is you can either, we don't have a big cross-reference on our website. So no, a China driver. So if it's a separate driver from a different competitor and you want to get an ERP replacement, then what you can do is you can either email support@ERP Power, or on our website, there's another kind of support-like email address called Save Energy at ERP Power, and you can send that email address, preferably either the model number or a picture of that driver. And I'm on both of those distribution lists, and I'll probably be the one that responds, or someone else on the team, and we'll let you know a valid replacement for that driver.
Well, I'm checking right now to make sure, but it looks like we've reached the end of our questions list. But I thought that was interesting what you just talked about in terms of the support for ERP drivers versus replacing drivers that were provided by other vendors. Do you have any other resources that you would like to recommend through ERP for replacing drivers in your in a luminaire manufacturer's product lineup?
Yeah, so we actually did a previous webinar through LEDs Magazine that kind of guides people through the process of identifying a correct cross for someone else's LED driver. So I don't know if that person wants to contact me, then I can send you the materials that we had for that webinar that can help you cross any driver that you're looking to cross.
That's great, because I'm not entirely sure that webinar is still available through our website archive. The archive for on demand goes up to 6 months. So if it hasn't expired yet, you may still be able to find that on our website and listen to the on-demand version. If it has, then you know, the appropriate thing to do, of course, would be to follow up with Mark directly and have a conversation about trying to determine what appropriate replacements would be. All right, well, I think that's all we have for now, and I guess we're just going to be able to let people go a little earlier than we expected. Mark, thank you so much for going through that demonstration. The programming of the LED drivers is very clear. You had a lot of great visuals. It almost seems to me like we went through a hands-on process with you, which I think is really valuable for people to see that and to see that it's not nearly as complex as they might be imagining that it could be, laid out in a way that is more streamlined and more intuitive for them to follow. So for our audience, Mark will receive a full report of the questions and any other follow-ups that come in, and ERP will respond back as appropriate with individual vendors that have inquiries. And that concludes today's presentation. On behalf of LEDs Magazine, I'd like to thank ERP Power for sponsoring today's webinar, and also to you and our audience for spending your time with us. We appreciate the support and the fact that you found this valuable. Have a great rest of your day.